going to share with you how her family arrived in Newry in the late 19th and early 20th century. And there were a small number of Jewish families in Newry, but not sufficient to form a synagogue. But as well as the Belfast Jewish community, there were organized Jewish communities not so far away from you in Lurgan. And there was another synagogue in Londonderry, the Londonderry Hebrew congregation. They both existed in the early 20th century, and in the case of Londonderry until just after the Second World War. But the largest community, of course, was in Belfast. And that community goes back to the 1860s. It's been around for a long time. We're probably the oldest ethnic and faith community in Northern Ireland. The founder of the community was a man called Daniel Joseph Jaffe. No relation of mine, unfortunately, because he was a very wealthy linen merchant. He arrived in Belfast in the year 1851. He'd been visiting previously, buying Irish linen, and in that year he was persuaded to settle and set up business in Belfast. But he wasn't really joined by other Jewish families until the 1860s. And the reason for that was the American Civil War. There was a blockade on the southern ports of the United States. And as a result, cotton couldn't be sourced in the world textile markets, and Irish linen became even more important. And there was an influx of German Jewish linen merchants into Belfast in the 1860s. And we hear for the first time of Jewish religious services being held. The first one was in Holywood, County Down, about the middle of the 1860s. And the first synagogue in Belfast is opened in 1871 in Great Victoria Street, just on the same side as the Europa Hotel. A little bit further down was the first synagogue. These were exporters of linen, and to give you some idea of the scale of their business, the Jaffe brothers, Daniel Joseph Jaffe's firm, their first offices is today the 10 Square Hotel at the back of City Hall, if you're familiar with that. Another firm built what is today the Linen Hall Library. The name of the linen firm was Moore and Weinberg, and it was eventually taken over by the Lowenthal family. This was another German Jewish linen firm, and you can see the scale of it if you've ever been inside the Linen Hall Library. It's a very substantial building. And they were selling linen across the world. In addition to the linen industry, of course, the other great industry in Belfast is shipbuilding, and the firm of Harland and Wolff. Well, Gustav Wolff was also a German Jew, not by faith because he was baptized as a Christian as a child, but like the linen merchants, his family connections were across Europe. And it was largely through Gustav Wolff that the order books of the shipyard of Harland and Wolff was kept full. So both shipbuilding and the linen industry had a very important Jewish contribution towards it. Now, Lill's family and my own family come from another wave of Jewish immigration into what is now Northern Ireland. Our families come from further Eastern Europe. My own family is from Poland, and they arrived late 19th, early 20th century. Most of them settled in North Belfast, round about the Lower Crumlin Road. That was Belfast's Little Jerusalem. If they had trades, they would have been tailors, glaziers, cabinet makers, but many of them didn't have a trade, and they were door-to-door peddlers going across Belfast and wider across the province of Ulster, selling goods literally from a pack on their back. And this is how many of the early Jewish settlers first made their living once they arrived here. The community of this new influx coming from Eastern Europe were very Orthodox, very strictly observant of the Jewish faith. And they prayed where they lived in North Belfast. They didn't want to go to the synagogue in Great Victoria Street, too far away and a little bit too liberal and progressive for their likings. Eventually, a new synagogue was opened at Annesley Street at the bottom of the Antrim Road, just off Carlisle Circus, in the area where the Jews, the new Jewish immigrants were now living. Typically, the Jewish peddlers eventually were able to open up a shop, and many of the Jewish businesses that perhaps you will be familiar, that you might remember, would have started that way. I mean, a very big concern, which had stores in Belfast and many provincial towns, which you might remember, is called Gurwich's. They were a ladies' fashion store. I think they had a store in Dungannon, so again, not too far away from where you are, but there was a number of shops across Northern Ireland. So that was a very big concern. Another one that you might remember would be Burwood's, which I think was a furniture store, if I'm not mistaken, and that was in Portadown. So as well as the commercial contribution of the Jewish community, there was also an enormous cultural contribution. There was a third wave of Jewish immigrants immediately before the Second World War, and they were refugees from Nazi Germany. Obviously very appropriate to mention them this evening. Some of them were children. The British government allowed 10,000 Jewish children to enter from Nazi-occupied Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, but not their families. And about 30 of those children ended up in Belfast. And during the Blitz, they were taken to a refugee farm, which was at Malile in County Down. Now, some of these German Jews made an enormous contribution to the cultural life of Northern Ireland. One I'll mention is Helen Lewis, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, came after the Second World War. Her first husband had been murdered, but she was contacted by a former boyfriend who brought her over and they got married. She taught dance to generations of school children in Northern Ireland, and she really introduced modern dance to Belfast and the province. A couple of actors you might have heard of is Harold Goldblatt and Harry Tobe, two Belfast Jewish actors, and the group theatre in Belfast, which was the first kind of professional theatre of its kind, brought together three different dramatic groups in Belfast, one of which was the Belfast Jewish Dramatic Society. So a small community which never numbered more than about 1,200 at its height after the Second World War, made a significant contribution to the cultural life of Northern Ireland. Another name to mention, which if any of you like jazz, you will instantly remember the name Solly Lipschitz, who was a great jazz commentator. The Jewish community today in Northern Ireland numbers about 70 people. That's members of the synagogue. And the average age of the community is probably a little bit in advance of 70. It's an elderly community. But they still have a functioning synagogue on the Somerton Road, well, functioning when we're not in lockdown, with its own minister. And the community continues to make an enormous contribution. For instance, it has a senior citizens club, which would have met in normal times on a Wednesday, and brought in senior citizens, not just from the Jewish community, but the wider community as well. There's a thriving branch of the Council of Christians and Jews in Northern Ireland as well. So for a small community, it still punches above its weight. And I think this is a very appropriate story to tell in advance of Lill's story, because what we're going to hear is a grim story of the worst persecution during the 30s and 40s in Nazi Germany. It's important to remember as well the very positive story of the Jewish people and its contribution both locally and nationally, but it's also a story of tolerance, because the Jewish community in Northern Ireland was tolerated, accepted, encouraged and supported. And I think that is an amazingly positive story to share, particularly when we're going to address a period in history where anti-Semitism was so rampant in large parts of Europe. So I'm going to finish at that point. Thank you very much for listening. And having heard Lill already, I know we're in for an absolutely incredible evening. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Breach, and also thank you to Stephen and all the listeners and viewers. My name is Lill Fanny Saether and I live in Oslo, Norway. and in County Clare in Ireland, where I am at the moment. It's an honor to be asked by your historic society to speak in connection to the commemoration of the Holocaust. I've actually been visiting Prony in Belfast and found information about the family in the archives. In addition, my good contact, Stephen Jaffe, and also Nigel Neville and Nigel Henderson have contributed with valuable information. The time frame for this event only allows a brief review of my mother's life, which started in Newry in 1909 and ended in Oslo in 1998. It was an adventurous journey with extraordinary things happening to her. Because she was Jewish and because she was a warm, caring, and conscious woman who took upon herself heavy responsibilities when it was required. My mother did not only survive the Holocaust, she also saved several other people's lives. I will concentrate this talk on the Irish connection and the events of the war. But first, a few words about the family background. My Jewish maternal great-grandparents, Abraham Simon and Rhoda Jette Freeman, came from a shtetl in Kaunas in Lithuania in the then Russia. They immigrated with 9 children by ship to Northern Ireland around 1890. The reason for this brave and daring decision was the anti-Semitism and persecutions and pogroms that the Jews experienced in the Russian Empire. They had to live in designated areas, so-called scales of settlement, and in some of the settlements they were confined to the smaller villages, shtetls in Yiddish. In addition, Jews could, for instance, not choose certain education or professions, and the young Jewish boys had to serve many more years military service than the rest of the population. The pogroms were violent anti-Jewish riots aimed at harassing and killing the Jews and burning down their dwellings. My grandmother, Florence, called Flory, was born in 1883 in a pale of settlement in the shtetl Salantai in Lithuania on the border to today's Latvia. When leaving Russia, Abraham Simon and Rhoda Jette were aiming for America, like many immigrants from Eastern Europe those days. But instead they ended up in Newry. They were made to believe they had arrived in New York, being victims of fraud by the captain on the ship that brought them, thus him saving both time and money. The immigrants would not know what either of the towns looked like, and they did not speak or read English, knowing only Russian and Yiddish. I visited my mother's cousin, Abraham Freeman, in Belfast several times before he died some years back. Both he and some of his Jewish friends spoke of the same fraud being the reason for why they ended up living in Belfast. But the Freemans were lucky. Upon their arrival in Newry, they were taken care of and welcomed by John Stokes and his family. John Stokes was a linguist and consul general for several countries. He helped everyone who could not speak English with housing and other practical matters during the first few months. And I've actually met John Stokes' grandson, David Rice, who lives here in Killaloe. And I've had email contact with Leonard Abrahamson, whose family was helped by John Stokes when they arrived in Newry. Abraham and Rhoda Jette settled in Cecil Street in Newry and had one more child after arriving. So here they are, some years later. My grandmother was 7 years old when the family arrived in Newry. In Prony, I found that she went to Ballybot National School for 5 years from January 1891. Ballybot was a school open to all faiths, unlike many schools in Northern Ireland. In the school protocol, it is noted that Flory was never at national school. She might have been going to school in Lithuania, or she might not. In many shtetls, only boys went to school. This was shortly after their arrival in Newry, and Flory might not have mastered the language very well. In spite of this, she did well in school. Abraham's occupation is also noted in the school protocol. He was a traveler, or I suppose peddler, as Stephen said. He was earning his living as a traveling salesman, like many Jews did. It was one of few occupations open to them in Russia, and quite easy to pick up anywhere. 4 of Florey's brothers also went to Ballybot. Abraham became British citizen in March 1903. Rhoda Yetta and 7 of their children also became British subjects, including Florey. At this time, the family was living in Mill Street. In 1906, Abraham worked as a draper, and he's registered in Cecil Street as a dealer, probably in fabric. Florey married my grandfather, Joseph Mendel, in Newry in 1906. He was born in Libau, today's Liepaja in Latvia. He grew up in Manchester after his father emigrated to UK a few years later than the Freeman. Florey and Joseph got married in the family Freeman's home in Mill Street and settled in Kilmore Terrace. Joseph earned a living as a credit traveling salesman. 3 of their children were born in Newry: Abraham in 1908, my mother, Elsie, in August 1909, and Saether Miriam in 1911. My grandfather became British citizens in January 1911, as did the 3 children. The year after Florey and Joseph got married in 1907, Abraham's Simon died, and at some point Rhoda Yetta moved with the youngest son to Belfast, where she died in 1937. The family Mendel left Newry for Norway in August 1911. They went to Norway because Joseph's sister and her husband, who had immigrated to Norway in 1905, wrote letters to the family members telling them of the good prospects in Norway. The move to Norway sealed the family's fate in 1942. After approximately a year in Oslo, called Christiania at the time, the family settled in Norway, the Norwegian town of Trondheim, where my grandfather opened a shop, selling mercery and general goods. The 2 youngest children were born in Trondheim, Esther in 1914 and Harry Isidor in 1918. But here they are, except Harry Isidor was not yet born when these photos were taken. My mother to the right in the first photo and to the left in the second. My mother spent her childhood and all her school years in Trondheim. She got a good education for her time, especially for women of her time. After primary and secondary school, she graduated from the Commerce High School. During the First World War, 1914 to 18, 3 of Florey's brothers enlisted as soldiers: Joseph, Louis, and Isaac Michael Freeman, as documented in the Belfast Daily Telegraph. Louis got a lifetime disability in 1914, and Isaac Michael, to the left, was killed in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Around 1920, Rhoda Yetta came from Belfast to live with the family for a while. She was receiving a pension from the army for the loss of her son, and she reported her movements there to the army authorities in Britain regarding her pension payment. Louis also came to Trondheim around the same time, probably escorting his mother, and he was also helping out in the shop. In 1922, my grandfather was bankrupt, leaving the family in a quite poor state for some years. They left Trondheim in 1928 and were living in 4 different places in southeast Norway before settling in Oslo in 1938. My grandmother took up his old trade as a traveling salesman, and that would be his profession the rest of his life. The oldest brother, Abraham, emigrated to USA in 1930. Then very short on the development in Germany during the 1930s. From what the Germans perceived as an unfair armistice in 1918 and the Versailles Treaty of 1919 and the Great Depression a few years later, the Nazi Party rose rapidly from obscurity to becoming the largest party in the German parliament in 1932. Hitler and other Nazi propagandists directed the people's anger and fear against those they held responsible, the Jews and the communists and the Social Democrats. Hitler was appointed as chancellor in January 1933, which paved the way to Nazi dictatorship in Germany. The Nuremberg laws of September 1935 were anti-Semitic and racist. There were two laws. First, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which forbade marriages between Jews and Germans. And secondly, the citizenship law, which declared that only those of German or related blood could be citizens, including the Jews, among others, meaning the German Jews lost their citizenship. The Nuremberg meeting also determined a detailed racial classification system that decided who was considered Jewish. Not very easy to see, but it was, of course, determined by how many Jewish grandparents you had. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, thus starting the Second World War, the Jews in Poland were singled out. They had to carry armlets with the Star of David, and they were forced to live in designated areas. Joseph and Florrie had become Norwegian citizens in 1937. The two sisters, Elsie and Sadie Miriam, kept their British citizenship. This should prove to be a stroke of luck. The two youngest, born in Norway, on the other hand, became Norwegian citizens. The Norwegian citizens would not be a protection against racial persecution, while the British, on the other hand, should prove to be. Now, I have quite a lot of knowledge and information about what happened to the family during the Nazi occupation of Norway from April 9, 1940 to May 8, 1945. My mother did convey some incidents, and my grandmother's diary that I found a while back delivers a substantial account of what happened to the family in October and November 1942 during the persecution, arrest, and deportation of the Jews in Norway. Norway's National Archives also holds a lot of information. German forces invaded Norway despite it declaring neutrality. The armed resistance ended in June 1940, and from then Nazi Germany controlled Norway and ruled by dictatorship. From February 1942, in collaboration with the Norwegian Nazi Party, which was the only legal party, under its leader Vidkun Quisling, the Norwegian King Haakon VII and the pre-war government escaped to London, where they acted as a government in exile during the whole war. After the occupation, horrific prison camps were introduced. There was comprehensive censorship, and there was also quickly a lack of food, and most goods were rationed over the course of the war. There were long queues in front of the shop to get hold of the few goods available, and people had to be inventive and finding substitutes for most groceries and other goods. My mother, for instance, told me she had a dress she had sewn of an old curtain. During the German occupation, many Norwegians were subject to persecution, arrest, torture, and execution for resisting the occupation and Nazi rule, or for doing or saying anything the Nazis found offensive. But there were also quite a few Norwegians within the police and judiciary who collaborated with the Germans. The Norwegian Nazi Party, headed by Vidkun Quisling, gained a lot of new members like in Germany. The Jews in Norway were early subject to special provisions. Their radios were confiscated 1 year prior to the rest of the population, and there were random arrests of Jewish men, including refugees from European Nazi-occupied countries. Some were let out again, but some remained in captivity. After Quisling's inauguration in February 1942, all Jews had to meet up at the local police station to have their ID card stamped with a J. They also had to fill a 4-page form with all kinds of personal information, including birthplace, citizenship, and information about their property and financial status. In addition, whether they had been charged or convicted for any criminal offense. None of the members of the Mendel family had been charged or convicted. The Jews must have asked each other, what do the Nazis need this for? People knew to a certain degree what was going on in Nazi-occupied Europe, and that Jews in Germany, Poland, and France were deported to so-called labor camps. The Norwegian population obtained uncensored news through 2 channels. The government in exile transmitted radio broadcasts from BBC every evening. They were forbidden to listen to, but people did anyway because they had been hiding away radios. And there were many illegal newspapers being distributed. But neither did convey the whole truth. Why didn't the Jews try to escape in time? A few had already fled to neutral Sweden or to UK via the Shetland Islands. But the journey was strenuous and dangerous. In addition, there was death penalty for Jews who were captured while trying to flee and for those assisting them. Many had built their lives in Norway from nothing after escaping Tsarist Russia, and they had children, elderly, and sick relatives holding them back. They also had a naive faith in the Norwegian democracy and the Norwegian legal system, but neither was as they had known them anymore. And anyhow, who could have imagined what was awaiting them? Here are a few pages from my grandmother's diary documenting the events of autumn 1942. The real persecution started by the arrest of all male Jews in October 26, 1942, heavily assisted by Norwegian bureaucracy and police force. My mother's youngest brother, who was born in Norway, Harry Isidor, was arrested the next day and he was held in prison until November 26. My grandfather was newly operated for hernia in Norway's largest hospital. At that time, my mother was employed in a shop belonging to a Jewish man. She warned him in the morning after the arrest. As he came into the shop, she said, "Get out of here. Find somewhere to hide. They're arresting the men." And as the owner turned round and stepped out of the shop, the police came in looking for him. My mother kept her calm, though her knees were shaking, and on their question, who was that? She replied, "I don't know, a customer." They asked if she knew where the owner was, and she said calmly, "No, I haven't seen him today." He saved his life and escaped to Sweden with his family at the beginning of December. After the men were imprisoned, it was unthinkable for the women to try and escape, leaving them behind. And they could not imagine that the Nazis would do women and children any harm. But they would. When the Nazis and Norwegian police came to arrest the women and children in the morning of November 26th, the 4 women in the family Mendel were home. My mother told me many times, as documented in my grandmother's diary, how she said to the policeman, "My sister said that Miriam and myself are British subjects, so you cannot arrest us." My mother knew that some nationalities were exempt from the arrest order issued the day before, among them Jewish citizens of USA and UK and Germany's allies. So due to their British citizenship, my mother and her sister were not detained. Neither was my grandmother, her husband being terminally ill in hospital. The police agreed to wait for 2 weeks with the detention of my grandmother and grandfather until my grandfather had recovered or had died. To make sure she would not flee, my grandmother was ordered to report to the police station every day. At this time, my grandfather was not that ill anymore. He was in fact in hiding in the hospital. Many of the staff in Norway's hospital did a tremendous job hiding Jews and thus saving their lives. So the 3 women were left, but the Nazis took the youngest sister Esther with them. And on this day, the prison ship MS Donau was waiting by one of Oslo's quays. The women and children arrested were transported there from all over Oslo, and the men arrested in October, among them Harry Isidor, arrived from different prisons and camps. There was chaos, despair, and fear on the quay, with screaming children and women begging for mercy. To no avail, they were forced, women and men separate, by aggressive commands, kicks and blows, on board the ship and down on the deck into 2 separate cargo holds. The ship left Oslo at 14:55 on the 26th of November. My mother's 2 youngest siblings were 2 of 532 people, 302 men, 188 women, and 42 children on board. The youngest was 4 months, the oldest 80 years old. The journey took 4 days in horrendous weather. When arriving in the Polish town Stettin, they were loaded onto trains in cattle carts under massive harassment. They were standing so tight they could not sit down. No food or drink were offered. On the arrival to Auschwitz, December 1st, both my mother's siblings were brought directly to the gas chamber, together with the other women and children. My grandmother describes the heartbreaking farewells in her diary. During the rest of the war, she never gave up hope to see her children again. She mentions it frequently in her letters to the family in Ireland, England, and America. The rough copies of these letters are also in that same book as her diary. In total, the Germans and the Norwegian Nazis deported 776 Jews from Norway during the Second World War. This was 53% of the registered Jews in the country. Only 32 men survived the ordeal and returned to Norway after the war. In addition to the Jews, thousands of Romani, disabled people, and homosexuals were deported, and many were murdered. In the middle of the night on December 8, my mother rescued her father and another Jewish man from the hospital. It was extremely dangerous. There was a curfew and blackout enforced especially strict in the towns. It was pitch dark when my mother sneaked through a hole in the fence surrounding the hospital and walked carrying a suitcase across an icy and slippery lawn towards the cellar door. She knocked, the door opened, and she had to step into the darkness without seeing anything. When the door closed behind her, a nurse with a torch led her up some stairs and into a room where my grandfather and the other man were waiting. In the suitcase, my mother had clothes for the 2 of them, because Jews were not allowed to keep their clothes available while admitted in hospital to prevent them from fleeing. After the men had dressed, the 3 of them went back the same way, down the stairs and into the dark, the door closing behind them. Outside the fence, they were picked up by good Norwegians with cars, who, at a great risk, took them to different houses in town, where they went into hiding, as did my grandmother and my mother's sister. There were quite a lot of Norwegians engaged in hiding Jews and transporting them out of the country. And many of those heroes were women. And it was my mother who contacted the rescuers and arranged the escape for her family. They stayed in hiding for 1 week until the night of December 15th and 16th, when they escaped to Sweden. There were several escape organizations helping people to flee, first and foremost to Sweden. The people in these organizations were true heroes. It was, as I said earlier, a death penalty for helping people fleeing, especially Jews. The leader of the organization helping my family was a former police officer who was expelled when he rejected saluting the Nazi way. After being expelled, he was working in a transport company, thus having access to vehicles. In addition, he was from the border region and knew all the back roads to Sweden. He spoke fluent German and managed to talk them out of the many checkpoints and patrols along the road. In addition, there were people posted along the road warning them of random patrols. The journey to the border took about 4 hours. Today it is 1.5. It was icy and snowy on the roads, and the lorries were old, only with worn summer tires, running on wooden pallets as petrol was scarce. The lorries were holding approximately 20 refugees, hiding under the canopies behind sacks of pellets or potatoes. They had to sit completely still and not make a sound. The children were giving sleeping tablets, not risking that they would start crying. It was freezing cold, hazardous, nerve-wracking, and an enormous physical strain on the refugees. They were left off quite close to the border, and then they had to walk in total silence through the forest in the dark on a snow-filled and icy path. They were holding on to and helping each other as best they could. My mother told me she was carrying a child whose mother had 2 children and could only carry one. Coming across the border, they were met by Swedish border police and brought indoors, served hot chocolate and food they had not had for more than 2 years. This particular organization rescued more than 1,000 people during the autumn and winter of 1942 and 43, until the members themselves had to flee, as the activity had been tracked down by the Nazis. One of the rescuers were later captured and executed. I have visited the Norwegian National Archives several times and found a lot of documents on the family. Among them, how the Norwegian Nazis robbed their apartment of furniture and other belongings. After having registered it, they sold most of it at auctions. Except furniture belonging to my mother and what the family had been able to salvage before fleeing. A faithful long-term lodger in Kleven rescued their most valuable belongings, jewelry, silver, photos, and documents. Without him, this story might never have been told. I have many letters, especially letters from my grandmother and my mother after my mother traveled by air as one of very few from Sweden to Scotland in April 1943. She got a position at the Norwegian consulate in Glasgow. I also have some letters my grandmother wrote to my mother after the liberation in May 1945, when they had returned to Norway. Their homecoming in July 1945, especially how they were searching for their belongings and their heartbreaking efforts to get compensation for losing their 2 children, is documented in the Norwegian National Archives. My mother did not come back to Norway until October 1945 after the consulate had closed down. My mother saved her life because she was a British citizen, because she was knowledgeable and extremely responsible and brave, and because some Norwegians were unbelievably heroic and risked their own life to save others, and finally because Sweden was neutral and, at least from autumn 1942, received refugees from Norway unconditionally, including Jews. It had not always been like that. It is important to commemorate the Holocaust, to make sure it is never forgotten and that it will never happen again. Those denying the Holocaust must not gain ground. And since most of the contemporary witnesses now are dead, those of us who were told of the events and can document them should convey this as loud and often as we can. Here are Esther and Harry Isidore, and the tumbling stones in the pavement outside their home in Oslo to remember them and to commemorate what happened to them during the Holocaust. So how do we prevent such genocide from happening again? We must look at our own time and discover current phenomenon of the same kind as during the prelude to and during the Second World War. Increasing prejudice, discrimination, hate, and racism due to religion, color, ethnicity, sexual preference, or other reasons. We must speak up against people being prejudged and persecuted and killed for what they are. Black lives matter, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian lives matter, all lives matter. Thanks again to Jonathan Gray and Gilly Shield and Colonel Nace Historic Society, and thank you all very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Lill. As I said earlier, everybody, if you have any questions to give Stephen or Lill, if you can just drop me a wee line here on the chat. Just give me a wee minute to get through everything. So if you have any questions, folks. Lill, you can hear me okay still, Lill? Yep.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, just a wee line here from Sarah Duncan. My grandmother was Seraphima Freeman, went from Poland to Manchester. So that's from Sarah Duncan. Peter asks, Lily, or Lill, how many languages did your grandparents speak?
Well, they spoke Yiddish, and I suppose when they were children, when my grandmother was a child, she spoke Russian as well.
Yeah.
My grandfather was just more a toddler when he came to Manchester. Then they spoke English and Norwegian.
My goodness. Yeah.
But my grandmother's diary, you might have noticed, was in English, and she always wrote in English.
Yeah, I did notice that, funny enough. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Question from Brendan, Lill. Why do you think the Nazis allowed British citizens to escape the anti-Jewish laws? Good question, Brendan.
Yeah, well, I was asked that in Prony too, and then I wasn't thinking straight, but there are actually some rules in war.
Mm-hmm.
And UK and USA, they were involved with them, but they were not occupied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So autumn 1942, they left them and they obeyed by those rules. But in spring 43, they didn't give a damn about anything, neither citizenship or whether people were terminally ill. Then everyone were arrested.
Yeah.
So it was just in the beginning they were a bit more lenient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But people who were British citizens and who were arrested during spring 1943, they were reckoned as prisoners of war, and they were in a prison camp in France. They were not sent to Auschwitz.
Yeah. Right, just a few more here now. I even just wanted to make the comment that it's been more powerful hearing your story, Lill, than watching a documentary. Just thanking you. Question would be, did your mother ever get the chance to visit Israel?
No, she never visited Israel, and more strangely enough, she never visited Ireland or Newry.
Oh,
Yeah, I have visited Newry, but she
you
didn't.
visited Newry. From Jerry, wondering how the Belfast jury were able to help the refugees being persecuted.
Well, I think that's a question for Stephen.
Stephen, if you're still with us here, hold on. I'll have to unmute Stephen here. Just give us a wee second. Stephen, if you're still about there, just a wee question there. I don't know if you caught that. Okay, Stephen, just bear with me.
I did. Thanks. So the Belfast Jewish community did what it could. For example, I mentioned that 30 children from the Kindertransport. These were children that the British government permitted entry into the UK. About 30 of them came to Northern Ireland. They were put up in a hostel in Clifton Park Avenue in North Belfast, and they were looked after by the community. The Jewish community also sponsored the refugee farm at Malile, which I mentioned,
Yes.
which was set up in, I think, 1938, 1939, by teenagers from a Zionist religious youth group called Bachad. They came from Prague, from Vienna, and from Germany. And they set up this farm in Malile, which was run on what we would describe today as on kibbutz lines, if you're familiar with the kibbutz in Israel. And they learnt farming in Malile from local agricultural instructors. The Jewish community was supported very much by wider society. In particular, the Quaker community was very supportive of Jewish refugees, but there was support from the churches and from the wider community as well. There was a Belfast Refugee Committee, and refugees as well were at the university at Queen's, some of them. Some of them were working in the shirt factories in Derry. Some of them working as agricultural labourers on farms across Northern Ireland. So there were literally a few hundred of them, and the Jewish community provided guarantees to the British government. You had to provide a guarantee that the refugees would not be a burden on the state. So it did what it could, but the size of the problem was so huge, and sadly, millions of Jews were not able to leave Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland when it got overrun. The countries were not prepared to admit large numbers of Jewish refugees.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Steve. Couple more questions. Peter again, how did you finish up in County Clare? So I meant to ask that question myself. What drew you to County Clare?
Well, that is maybe a lot of coincidences, but anyway, I married a man who was born in Watford, but who has 2 Irish parents, and we started coming to Ireland for holiday.
Very good.
We went for many years to Willie Clancy Week in Milltown, and then we decided maybe we should have a holiday or retirement home here, and that's how we ended up here. So we're just 1 mile south of Milltown.
Very good. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Once again, everybody has Irish roots, Lill. And those that don't think they have usually find out at some later stage that yes, I do. So yeah.
Yeah.
Let me see now. A few more questions. I don't know whether it's a Barry or a Barney Aiken or whatever. A privilege to hear and bear witness to such a moving history. You must be so proud of your mother. After the war, were those Norwegians who were Quislings brought to justice? And why do you think that the Jews from Denmark nearly all managed to escape and those in Norway did not? So that's a very good detailed question there. Would you have any insight into that, Lill?
Yeah, well, what was the first question?
Sorry, just basically, after the war, were those Norwegians who were Quislings brought to justice?
Oh, yes. Yeah, well, Quisling was actually hanged, I think. And a few of them were, but there were also quite a few people who were helping out with these arrests, for instance, or the person who was heading the police force in Oslo. A lot of them, they were able to not being prosecuted for this offense at all. So there were a lot of people who were let out, but they were imprisoned for other reasons, but not for this crime that was committed to the Jews were not reckoned to be as big as other crimes they had committed.
Yes,
So we still have a lot of wounds in Norway because there were people who should have been prosecuted for it.
there are similar experiences in other European countries as well. I know that experience is not unique to Norway. Yeah. And regards the Danish
but then
element.
it was the Danes. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the Danish police and the Danish authorities didn't run so much, even if the fact was that we were occupied in another way than Denmark, because they surrendered. Norway never did.
Yeah. No.
But
that's right.
anyway, they were able to rescue their Jews in a total different manner, because there were more people willing to risk their lives to do it.
Yeah.
And of course, they weren't under such a dictatorship as we were.
No. That's correct. So, any other questions there, everybody? Before I hand back to Breeze here, I'm just going to unmute you, Breeze, if you can just bear with me a minute. Okay, I'll hand over to Breeze to wrap things up here. And okay, Breeze.
I would like. Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I would like to extend our thanks to Stephen and Lill. That was a very informative evening, and I certainly have learned a lot of things, and I have a lot of things to ponder on and research. It was a very frank and horrific account of what did happen, and I think the onus is on each of us to make the effort to try, and I say try, and prevent something similar happening again. We all have a responsibility. And I would like to ask everyone to just a round of applause for Stephen and Lill. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Breeze. Yes, I would just echo what Breeze said there. A very powerful presentation and beautifully put together. I think having all the family photographs and documents and things very much puts a very powerful human element on it. We've all in our time have seen documentaries about the Holocaust, and there's always that fear that the more and more we see those, that in some way it dulls our memory of it. And I think the more times we have direct accounts from people and their families, I think brings it home to us much more strongly. And thanks again to Lill and Stephen for being with us tonight and for bringing this story and this message. So I have been recording this event, everybody, and I'll have a wee bit of editing to do, etc. But I would hope to be uploading the video to our Historical Society website, which is kaleeshalclonaneast.org. So easy enough to find on Google. If you look, there's a section there called videos, and if you check back maybe in a week or two, hopefully we'll have the video of Lill and Stephen's presentation tonight. So thanks again to Stephen and to Lill. We'll do our best to keep in touch. I hope this is not the end of our contact. We don't have any members in Norway, Lill. Actually, I don't even know if we have any members in County Clare. So what do you call it? We'll do our best to keep in touch. And thanks again. And thanks very much to everybody that joined the talk. You're from all over the place. I barely know half of you. If you are interested in history talks, keep an eye out on our website for future presentations and things. And it's not always just specifically about our own local area, as indeed tonight wasn't. So thanks very much for everybody for joining us. And thanks again, Lill and Stephen. And take care and stay safe. and stay at home, which is the other message. Okay, everybody. So thank you.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Take care. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.